playwright who wrote mostly in French and one of the foremost figures of the French avant-garde theater. Beyond ridiculing the most venal situations, Ionesco's plays depict the solitude and insignificance of human existence in a tangible way. Ionesco is often considered a writer of the theater of the absurd, a labeling originally given to him by Martin Aslin in his book of the same name. Aslin placed Ionesco alongside contemporaries Samuel Beckett, Jean Genet, and Arthur Adamov, calling this informal group absurd, on the basis of Albert Camus' concept of the absurd. Interviewer: before we discuss your theater, let's go to know the type of man you are. Many says a man's character is already formed in childhood. Tell us about your childhood. First, you were born in Romania, correct? But you are Ionesco. I moved to France at the age 1.5. My mother tongue is French. Interviewer: did you live in Paris? I lived in Paris and in the country. In Paris, I lived on Blumet Street. With your parents? With my mother. Alone with her? No siblings? No siblings. My father left for Romania in 1918 when I was 6. At the end of the war is still on. There were big Berthas on planes flying over the city. They scared us silly. You were frightened? Terrible. So, child's fears, not nightmares. Real fear. Once a shell from Big Bertha, German Canyon, fell in Boyer Square, 40 meters from your home. From our home, we lived on a 6th floor of a small hotel. Do you remember this? Yes, I recall one evening I was terrified. My mother came home from work to calm me down. We went into the streets to run errands, seeing the lights and shoppers put me at ease. So you needed reassuring. I asked because I wonder if these childhood memories mark a man, or they mark you deeply. As a result, you have always needed a certain security around you. Of course, but I'm both timid and aggressive. Are you timid? Timid and aggressive. How are you timid? Do you have trouble talking to others? Yes, I also feel in constant danger. I'm never completely at ease with either myself or the world around me. Do you like being alone? Alone? Yes, I like having friends, but more and more I enjoy solitude. Alone in the cabin of a boat, alone at home. I love my wife and daughter, but they live a few days. I hole up my room and I can spend hours and days doing nothing. Never answering the phone, never feeling lonely. Never feeling lonely? Never. That's uncommon. Men get lonely when they are alone. Alone. I feel more lonely with others. Let's talk about your life as a young man. What work did you do before writing plays? Well, I studied, I went to a grammar school at Etonis Chapel in Paris. I began high school in Paris and finished in Bucharest. What were your dreams for the future or for a career? At age 3, I wanted to sell roasted chestnuts because they all smell so good. Yes, at 3.5, I wanted to be an officer. And at 4, I wanted to be a doctor. Not any doctor, but a family doctor. Dr. Duran with his beard. And later, I always wanted to write. Really? But before writing, how did you earn a living? I taught French in high school from 1936 to 1938. In 1938, I began my doctoral thesis at the Sorbonne, but I never finished it. Later, I worked for a publishing company. So you didn't come to literature and the theater completely by chance, your interest dates far back. It's deep in me. I could never do anything else. And you never wanted to do? And you never wanted to do? Only literature ever interests me. Not theater, really, but literature. Do you recall going to the theater as a child? Yes. Did it thrill you? At the age of 4, I went to a puppet show with my mother in Luxembourg. All the kids except me were laughing. My mother thought I was bored and wanted to leave, but I wasn't. I was flabbergasted, smitten. Nothing else at the theater has ever interested me as much. Nothing else? That's right, when I started in the theater, I adopted the style of a puppet show. Theater for me must be simplified and grotesque. Almost mechanical, as if someone were pulling the strings. To me, the world seems that way. The world? To me, the world seems grotesque, absurd, ridiculous, painful. Your theater is called Theater of the Absurd. What does absurd mean to you? That's a very difficult question. If I keep going, I get angry with God. I think it's absurd that he exists. Not absurd. Life isn't absurd. History isn't absurd. It's very logical. It can be explained. You can figure out why things occur. It isn't something within our existence that's absurd. It's our existence itself I find unimaginable, unthinkable. Why? Are such questions the basis for the plays you write in which people speak to another but can't truly communicate? They don't always communicate. In my deepest moment, I feel they don't communicate with me. They might communicate with another. Maybe they say things that I don't grasp, that seem foolish, insane. It is as if I were detached from the world and watching a spectacle. I can't quite comprehend. This is true for me, first place, including the bold soprano, but I too must be living this world. But I still feel this insecurity, this strangeness, this implausibility, this need to question. For the writer, how much real sincerity is there? You find this world absurd and you express it so, but how much of this absurdity is literature? How much it's you exaggerating this absurdity? Not much really. Still, there is a sort of cheating. You cheat out of property, out of fear of say something foolish. Still, you say stupid things, but you pretend the foolishness is foolishness, even it's sometimes very sincere. Therein lies the cheating. In your first works, your one-act plays, I'm referring more to plays like Victim of Duty, which includes a theory of theater at the end. Now I believe in this theory, but I'm not sure it's good, so I present it comically. Do you believe strongly in comedy? But it's hard for me to define comedy. Have you dissected it? Define comedy is a challenge. So far, no one has come up with a good definition. Then let's stick to the facts. For me, the world is a comedy because it's ridiculous. It's comical because it's tragic. For me, comedy is one side of the tragedy. The flip side of tragedy? The flip side, but also tragedy itself. Comedy is more tragic than tragedy. Tragedy has rules. Man battling fate, man destroyed by fate and by laws. Comedy has no laws. It's ridiculous because there is no fate. Having the fate condemned and destroy you is one way to give a life a meaning. But when there is not even fate, some say you construct plays like a clockmaker building a clock. Not at all. In the bal soprano, there is a total disorganization. Yet this progression The desynchronization is intended, but there is progression, obviously. A bit like in Fado. An absurd progression is an acceleration. It's natural. It's my breath, my rhythm, but it isn't really intended. Isn't this to the detriment of the characters? Are they instruments for you? Character no longer matters. Movements, it's what matters. Well, movement inhabits the characters. Do characters matter in the movement of the world? In a way, you deny them a personality, almost as if they were puppets. Yes, of course, we are all puppets. But in The Killer and Rhinoceros, you suddenly have a character with a civil status. He's a bit less a puppet. Somehow they're puppets. Some don't want to be puppets. So, is this an evolution in your work? You call it that, something new? Yes, but we first must define evolution. But it is something new. In a play like Rhinoceros, because your characters are more fleshed out, do you feel you are communicating more easily with the audience? I've always communicated with the audience, except maybe at the very beginning. At first, the audience didn't laugh during the Bold Soprano. Two critics came, so no one was laughing, and said the play wasn't serious. They gave it a low review. 3 or 4 years later, by some miracle, people everywhere started finding the play funny. So the critics decided it must be a serious play. They deemed it important theater. How bizarre. Afterward, the play drew plenty of laughs. Whether it was a misunderstanding or not, people everywhere were laughing. The play started in small theaters. Oddly enough, the play was defended by leftist intellectuals, the bourgeoisie of the 16th arrondissement, a French city. People who don't actually see eye to eye. Yes, the play was staged in Poland and Germany. Just in Yugoslavia and many countries, it played for different people, workers even, so it's not played restricted audience. You spoke of misunderstanding. So many questions you have. A later play, Rhinoceros, was success despite the bad reviews. Critics were offended because they thought their rhinos might be them. The so-called intellectuals did too. I prefer the term them intellectuals because for me, Einstein, Oppenheimer, and Bergson are true intellectuals. Under them are many who adopt the slogans and are imprisoned by power. I don't like them intellectuals because in Germany they were all Nazis. Before the war, and France they were very fascist. And now they are leftists because Russia is a powerful country. So I don't like intellectuals because they don't really think. They only think they do. They simply repeat slogans. They succumb to superior slogans. That's what Rhinoceros is. The rhinos are more than intellectuals than the man in the street. I feel intellectuals have a mass mentality. Interviewer. That's a novel idea because people always say the opposite. People have tried to explain Rhinoceros by saying you wanted to... It's not the masses. Yes, but it's a totalitarian spirit. True, but the basic experience is the Nazification of a country. I lived through this gradual Nazification. Many oppose it at first, but our numbers dwindle over time. One of our friends will say, surely the fascists are wrong. Once he said this, we knew the system was drawing him in. 2 or 3 weeks later, he joined the party, so our number dwindled dramatically. We resisted morally. I was no hero. I kept quiet, but it's very hard to be a moral hero and not succumb to propaganda. I had guilty conscience. I bothered people because I thought differently. So this plays as a trial for intellectuals. They're to blame for the rise of Nazism. Not the great intellects, but the professional intellectuals. Those who think a bit, writers, journalists, professors, the like, it's their fault. So, with a play whose parts are well oiled and comical, there lies an idea that in itself isn't comical. You've sometimes taken issue with socialist and political committed writers, but weren't you in their camp here? I was both with them and against them. Against them, they knocked me for writing plays without the message perfectly understandable. But when I wrote a play with a message, they scolded me because the message attacked them. Among the writers with message who opposed you, have you an illustrious adversary in Jean-Paul Sartre? Well, it's a classic quarrel. Let's not talk about Sartre. I don't want to say nothing bad about him. For you, he's an amphitheater. He capitulates to everything. The illustrious man writes a philosophy inspired by Heidegger and deems it last word and thought. In 1938 and 1939, he's all set to join the Nazis. He might well have. He lives peacefully through the war. Germany is defeated and he becomes a humanist again. Existentialism is a form of humanism, he says. Later, Russia becomes a very powerful and he becomes a communist sympathizer. And in his book, he embraces Marxism. With the revolt in Budapest, he says, history has now changed. You have to keep step with history. He'll never again shake a communist hand. When the revolt is quelled, he starts talking with the communists again. I don't criticize him for being a pro or communist. What I condemned is his weakness, his jolting. Has he mirrored his time too readily? He's simply the mirror of his time. You mightn't agree, but wasn't he also influenced Kafka as you were? At one time, yes, but this stance is no longer in step with history. I think Kafka inspired nausea more so than the wall. Does Kafka still influence you deeply, or is the past for you? You sound like a professor. There is no influence, or there is very little influence. There are meetings of minds, people with similarities. Yes, Kafka started first, then came people like Atanov with his first play, Blanket, Sartre, and Beckett. People say Kafka influenced them, or they express the spirit of an age, because if you are simply influenced by someone, you don't say anything interesting or new. Do any current playwright interest you? What plays did you see? Not much, nothing at all. Nothing at all? I often invited to dress rehearsals. Gingenet? He's a poor man. He's poor man's Girondux. He's so affected. No, I don't like him. I like prose, but his theater is awful. So you still don't like theater. That's right. Do you read novels? Not much. Who do you read? I'm losing interest in literature. I like Natalie Stroud, Michel Victor, and I love Beckett. He's frank, simple, generous, poetic. Many overlook how poetic Waiting Godot is. The line, "They give bird astride of a grave," is beautiful. It's Shakespearean. Beckett is a great man. Do you enjoy traveling? Yes, but not for the reasons others do. My aim is to feel out of my element, not to find how other people live, what they do, not to document. Now, to relive my childhood in a way, when the red of the poppies seemed much redder, and when the world seemed fresher. I travel to find that freshness again, to escape the familiar rituals that conceal something essential. I travel to recapitulate the wonder of living, the freshness. In France, I have trouble finding it. Did you find it in US? Well, yes, the first time 3 days. After that, I saw New York, a brutal, unbearable city with crude people.